Hello all. Welcome to Dragon in Winterfell, a podcast dedicated to analyzing and reviewing fantasy and history. Since this is my first episode, I'll start by giving a quick rundown of what this podcast is about. As you can probably tell by the title, I will focus primarily on the novel series A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, but I'll also discuss other books, films, and TV shows from time to time, particularly in the fantasy and historical fiction genres. With this episode, I am kicking off a series aimed at addressing the question everyone has been asking for the past 3 years. Will the book series A Song of Ice and Fire end in the same way as the TV show Game of Thrones? The short answer is no. It'll be very different. But let's look into why that is. Many will insist that the books will have the same or a similar ending to the show, but based on what both the author and the showrunner have said, that's simply not true. From the start, George has mentioned the butterfly effect of changes that were present from the very first season onward, which would make it impossible for the story in the show to align with his novels. Even David Benioff, one of the two showrunners, admitted that the story he was telling had parted ways from A Song of Ice and Fire. Here is an excerpt from an Entertainment Weekly interview with Benioff from 2016. People are talking about whether the books are going to be spoiled, and it's really not true. So much of what we're doing diverges from the books at this point, and while there are certain key elements that will remain the same, we're not going to talk about that much, and I don't think George is either. People are going to be very surprised when they read the books after the show. They're quite divergent in so many respects for the remainder of the show. And that's according to David Benioff, one of the two showrunners. Meanwhile, after the finale of Game of Thrones aired, George made a post on his blog, Not a Blog, where he explained that the show ending had both commonalities and differences with his novels. How will it all end? I hear people asking. The same as the show? Different? Well, yes and no, and yes and no, and yes and no, and yes. I am working in a very different medium than David and Dan, never forget. They had 6 hours for this final season. I expect these last 2 books of mine will fill 3,000 manuscript pages between them before I'm done. And if more pages and chapters and scenes are needed, I'll add them. And of course the butterfly effect will be at work as well. Those of you who follow this Not a Blog will know that I've been talking about that since season 1. There are characters who never made it onto the screen at all, and others who died in the show but still live in the books. So if nothing else, the readers will learn what happened to Jane Poole, Lady Stoneheart, Penny and her pig, Skahaz Shavepate, Arianne Martell, Darkstar, Victarion Greyjoy, Sir Garland the Gallant, Aegon VI, and a myriad of other characters both great and small that viewers of the show never had a chance to meet. And yes, there will be unicorns. Of a sort. More recently, George made another post on his blog doubling down on the fact that the books are very different from the show, informing us that his gardening style of writing has led him to expand even further away from Game of Thrones than A Song of Ice and Fire already was. Here are a couple of passages from the July 8th, 2022 blog post. I have been working in my winter garden. Things are growing and changing, as does happen with us gardeners. Things twist, things change, new ideas come to me, thank you Muse. Old ideas prove unworkable. I write, I rewrite, I restructure, I rip everything apart and rewrite again. I go through doors that lead nowhere and doors that open on marbles. Sounds mad, I know, but it's how I write, always has been, always will be, for good or ill. What I have noticed more and more of late, however, is my gardening is taking me further and further away from the television series. Yes, some of the things you saw on HBO in Game of Thrones you will also see in The Winds of Winter, though maybe not in quite the same ways. But much of the rest will be quite different. One thing I can say, in general enough terms that I will not be spoiling anything. Not all of the characters who survived until the end of Game of Thrones will survive until the end of A Song of Ice and Fire. And not all of the characters who died on Game of Thrones will die in A Song of Ice and Fire. Some will, sure, of course, maybe most, but definitely not all. Daenerys. Of course, I could change my mind again next week with the next chapter I write. That's gardening. And the ending? You will need to wait until I get there. So there you go. Will the book and the show endings be the same? Kind of yes, kind of no. Let's look at an example from Game of Thrones that we know for certain fits with George's yes and no stance, which is the Golden Company. The Golden Company is a group of sellswords led by Harry Strickland who sail to Westeros to support a claimant to the Iron Throne. That much is the same in both the books and the show, so we have a yes right there. But that's where the yeses end. If you look at the situations more closely, they couldn't be more different. While in Season 8 of Game of Thrones, the Golden Company are hired by Cersei Lannister to fight Daenerys Targaryen, in the novel A Dance with Dragons, they were initially hired to support the joined claims of Daenerys and Aegon VI Targaryen, yet they end up sailing and fighting with only Aegon as their client. And Aegon is fighting against Cersei Lannister and her supporters while waiting for Daenerys so that he can marry her. Is that situation the same? Well, yes and no. A technical truth was included, while the execution was 100% different. Now that we have that example, let's speculate on other ending details that are likely yes and no situations, starting with the King Arthur of our story, Bran Stark. Bran will be king in the North. Bran Stark's point of view chapters have plenty of foreshadowing for his likely future as the leader of the North. Not only is he the lawful heir, but readers witness him training in the ins and outs of political, practical, and ceremonial aspects of ruling the North. So while Bran is an incredibly magical character, his story and character arcs are very much rooted in Northern politics. He is the character we learn many of the Northern values from. It's from Bran we learn the names and much of the history of the kings in the North. It's with Bran that we explore the crypts where the dead Starks lay. And it's Bran who sits the high seat of Winterfell's Great Hall for the longest period of time within the novels. Unseating and displacing him is a massive turning point in the books, as there is no longer a Stark in Winterfell. And as the novels tell us over and over again, there must always be a Stark in Winterfell. In fact, Bran seems to be the embodiment of Winterfell, as his last chapter in A Clash of Kings shows him comparing the now ruined castle to himself and his own status. At the edge of the Wolf's Wood, Bran turned in his basket for one last glimpse of the castle that had been his life. Wisps of smoke still rose into the gray sky, but no more than might have risen from Winterfell's chimneys on a cold autumn afternoon. Soot stains marked some of the arrow loops, and here and there a crack or a missing merlin could be seen in the curtain wall. But it seemed little enough from this distance. Beyond, the tops of the keeps and towers still stood as they had for hundreds of years, and it was hard to tell that the castle had been sacked and burned at all. The stone is strong, Bran told himself. The roots of the trees go deep, and under the ground the kings of winter sit their thrones. So long as those remained, Winterfell remained. It was not dead, just broken. Like me, he thought, I'm not dead either. In this passage, George R.R. Martin is making Winterfell synonymous with Bran, leaving the character and readers on a hopeful note at the end of A Clash of Kings regarding the state of both the castle and its lord. Neither are dead, just broken for the time being. This is clearly foreshadowing Bran's eventual return to the castle, as well as his place of power there, following in the footsteps of previous Kings of Winter. It's also worth noting that the majority of Bran's page space has been dedicated to Winterfell, the North, and learning to rule there. Out of Bran's 21 total chapters in 4 out of the 5 currently published novels, 14 of those chapters take place in Winterfell during A Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings, while an additional 4 chapters take place north of Winterfell during A Storm of Swords. Thus far, only 3 chapters take place north of the Wall where Bran's magical training begins in earnest. That means 2/3 of the page space allotted to Bran is centered in Winterfell and saturated in northern politics. Only 1/3 takes place in the wild north and beyond the Wall. Thus far, none of Bran's time is spent south of Winterfell, let alone south of the Neck, where he's supposedly to become king. There has to be a reason why he is the only Stark point of view character we see learning the administrative and ceremonial aspects of Northern leadership. To be fair, Jon has already been schooled in these subjects and implements what he learned during A Dance with Dragons. but page space is actually being devoted to giving Bran lessons, which has to be done for a reason. In Bran's first chapter in A Game of Thrones, Ned instills in him the importance of a ruler not detaching themselves from execution. They achieve this by taking on the duty themselves. If Bran isn't intended by the author to take on this role, we might have learned this custom from the perspectives of Ned or Jon. But we get this info at the same time as Bran, because it's important that we learn it with him. My guess is that King Bran's weapon of execution will be summer rather than ice. His next POV chapter shows Bran's mastery over the labyrinth layout and secrets of Winterfell itself, as he says what he thinks is goodbye to his home by retracing every inch of the castle. When he climbs to one of the highest points and gazes down, he has the following musings. Bran could see all of Winterfell in a glance. He liked the way it looked, spread out beneath him, only the birds wheeling overhead while all the life of the castle went on below. Bran could perch for hours among the shapeless, rain-worn gargoyles that looked over the first keep, watching it all, the men drilling with wood and steel in the yard, the cooks tending their vegetables in the glass garden, restless dogs running back and forth in the kennels, the silence of the godswood, the girls gossiping beside the washing well. It made him feel like he was lord of the castle in a way even Robb would never know. Considering the fact that Robb is never in the north, while he is the region's ruler after Ned's death, that's some pretty heavy foreshadowing. Another piece of light foreshadowing comes in Bran's fourth chapter in the first novel, where he is placed in the Lord's high seat for a meeting with Tyrion Lannister. Hodor said, and he trotted forward smiling, and set Bran in the high seat of the Starks, where the lords of Winterfell had sat since the days when they called themselves the Kings in the North. The seat was cold stone, polished smooth by countless bottoms, the carved heads of direwolves snarled on the ends of its massive arms. Bran clasped them as he sat, his useless legs dangling. The great seat made him feel half a baby. This passage shows not only Bran seated in his future position for no apparent reason other than potential foreshadowing, but also reflects how unprepared he feels for the role. This of course mirrors his own father's feelings of inadequacy at holding the lordship that was meant for his older brother, despite serving as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North for a decade and a half. But that makes sense, as this is a story about preparing Bran for his future role. Another moment that stands out in the scene where Bran meets with Tyrion is the moment when the three direwolves who remain at Winterfell decide to attack their guest. It is Bran's voice that first issues the command to stop, while the acting lord, Robb, only responds after him. Here's the passage. "No!" Bran shouted from the high seat as Lannister's men reached for their steel. "Summer, here! Summer, to me!" The direwolf heard the voice, glanced at Bran, and again at Lannister. He crept backward, away from the little man, and settled down below Bran's dangling feet. Robb had been holding his breath. He let it out with a sigh and called, "Grey Wind!" His direwolf moved to him, swift and silent. Now there was only Shaggy Dog, grumbling at the small man, his eyes burning like green fire. "Rickon, call him!" Bran shouted to his baby brother, and Rickon remembered himself and screamed, "Home, Shaggy! Home now!" The Black Wolf gave Lannister one final snarl and bounded off to Rickon, who hugged him tightly around the neck. This might be a small moment, but Martin added this to illustrate for the readers how quick and commanding Bran can be in a crisis, which shows that he has the makings of a leader. And this isn't an attempt to bash Robb. Readers see him navigate the difficult terrain of war and politics, first through Bran's eyes and then Catelyn's. And he does incredibly well, especially considering how experienced and ruthless his opponents are. But as a supporting character, his main purpose is to service the stories of the main protagonists. In this case, the author gave him a backseat to highlight Bran. The rest of his Winterfell chapters serve as an education for Bran in engaging in northern politics as well as the finer details of warfare. In the chapters after Bran survives his attempted murder, he witnesses his older brother taking up the day-to-day duties of a lord, the calling of the banners, and the assembling of the region's military forces. He also witnesses Robb being challenged and tested by their bannermen and women, and how this is responded to by an acting lord. Once Robb departs, Bran's leadership lessons are taken up by Maester Luwin and Roderick Cassel. Throughout A Clash of Kings, Bran is shown performing the ceremonial and courteous side of leadership in welcoming and honoring nobles who come to Winterfell, even the ones he didn't particularly like. And though he would rather be training in the yard to be a knight, Bran realizes that being a lord is not as tedious as he had feared. and he begins to warm to his new role. While Bran is not the decision maker he was presented as in Season 2 of the show, during A Clash of Kings, he was the official Stark in Winterfell and attended every official meeting with various northern lords, ladies, and stewards, where they discussed inheritance, political marriage, food stores, taxes, military concerns, preparations for war, and possibly building a navy. In addition, he performed his courtesies and presided over the Harvest Feast, which was essentially a political event where many powerful people in the north were present. We also see him put his people first when he agrees to surrender Winterfell to the Ironborn rather than allow his people to die. The mundane day-to-day ruling of the North is so prominent in Bran's chapters that many readers find those chapters boring. But the fact remains, as the POV character with the most chapters in Winterfell and the most page space dedicated to learning Northern leadership and politics, it makes the most sense for him to be king in the North. And we know that Bran would be skilled in the position of Lord or King in the North, since he's in favor of changes that will improve the region, such as creating a navy. He also brought up valid suggestions regarding the Hornwood inheritance, suggesting that Lord Hornwood's illegitimate son gain his seat, which would have been a progressive step forward. His wish to send additional guards with Lady Hornwood would have also prevented her kidnapping and murder. In Bran's own thoughts, we know what he values in a leader once Winterfell is invaded by the Ironborn. A good lord protects his people, he reminded himself. I've yielded Winterfell to Theon. He chooses to yield despite his initial urge to fight, because the people and their safety are his main concern rather than his own pride. Martin also doesn't allow readers to forget that Bran is Robb's heir by having that repeated to him, and thus to the reader, over and over again by Maester Luwin, Sir Roderick, the Reeds, and by Bran himself. In Robb's last scene with Bran, even he brings it up, telling him that he is Lord of Winterfell until he and their father return. And unfortunately, Robb and Ned never returned. Though Bran being the true heir is something readers are told repeatedly, this fact is also something we are distracted from with a series of false claimants in the form of Bran's siblings. Most prominently, a number of characters wish to have Jon or Rickon take up the lordship. Meanwhile, the Boltons also have a false Arya in the form of Jane Poole to give themselves a claim to Winterfell through marriage to her. In addition to that, the Lannisters, Tyrells, and Peter Baelish have all tried to use Sansa for the same end. But those plots involving his siblings would turn to dust with the return of Bran, making all of those attempts red herrings intended to make Bran's rise more surprising, but narratively earned. The rebuttal to this would be that Isaac Hempstead Wright, the actor who plays Bran in the adaptation, revealed that Benioff and Wise told him that George said his character would be king. But he never actually confirms that the character was intended as king on the Iron Throne, just that he would end the series as a king. And I agree, Bran will be a king in the North. We also have the quote from George himself in Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon by James Hibberd, where he discusses the 2013 meeting he had with Benioff and Wise. It wasn't easy for me. I didn't want to give away my books. It's not easy to talk about the end of my books. Every character has a different end. I told them who would be on the Iron Throne, and I told them some big twists like Hodor and Hold the Door, and Stannis' decision to burn his daughter. There are two issues with this quote. First, George never says Bran is the one on the Iron Throne. Second, even though the authors shared with them who would sit the Iron Throne, Benioff and Wise clearly did not include that in the adaptation, since Drogon destroys the throne, meaning that no one is sitting the Iron Throne at the end of the show. What's more is that Bran is clearly not a king at the end of the TV series. Yes, they use that word for him, but he's just a figurehead. The last scene that we get with him, he's being carted away while Tyrion, a random sellsword, and a Night's Watch deserter rule the realm in his stead. And the creature inhabiting Bran's body? That's the three-eyed raven. That's not Bran himself. So Bran is not a true king in the end of the adaptation. I'm not even sure what he is. But that's another issue from the show that needs to be unpacked. The Game of Thrones ending for Bran involves his body becoming the vessel of the Three-Eyed Raven, a show-only entity that essentially replaces Bran and uses his husk as a host. Some will try to claim that the Three-Eyed Raven is the show version of the Three-Eyed Crow. This is false. A crow appears repeatedly in Bran's dreams in the novels, similarly to what happens with the raven in the early seasons of the show. Where they differ is that the show treats the three-eyed raven as an official job title for a creature that's meant to take over Bran, while the three-eyed crow in the books is just the form that Bloodraven unknowingly takes in Bran's dreams, and the name is more of a description of what he looks like rather than an official title. Much of the time, the crow is simply referred to as the crow rather than the three-eyed crow, which again is a description of what the crow looks like. Bloodraven appearing as a crow with 3 eyes in Bran's dream is the same as Bran appearing as a slender weirwood with 3 eyes in Jon's dream in A Clash of Kings. No one refers to Bran as the 3-eyed weirwood since, like the 3-eyed crow, it's just a physical description in that dream. These are simply dream avatars for Bloodraven and for Bran that neither of them even seem to be aware of. Since the show ending hinges on this show-only entity of the 3-eyed raven, there's no reason to assume that the setup for show Bran's ending has much in common with the ending for Bran in canon. Another reason I have a hard time believing that Bran will be king in the South is due to Bran's lack of connection with the southern regions. When the story begins, Bran's dreams are very southern. He dreams of traveling to King's Landing and becoming a knight who lives out the stories he loves. But that dream is stolen from him by Jaime Lannister, whose attempt to murder Bran leaves him paralyzed. Due to the attempted murder, he was unable to travel to King's Landing and has spent the last 5 books in the north and beyond the wall, with no connection to the south in his arc. Making him king of all Westeros, especially just the southern regions, would be far too random. Yes, I know, George R.R. Martin is known for his shocking twists, but the beauty of those twists is that the reader can go back and find the foreshadowing and build-up that initially went unnoticed. For instance, Ned Stark's impending death felt like the most obvious thing in the world upon a reread. It was the same with Robb's death. We even see a version of the Red Wedding in A Clash of Kings. There doesn't seem to be any build-up for Bran's rise to the Iron Throne, but there is plenty of evidence for Bran becoming king in the north, since he is the actual embodiment of Winterfell. I would also like to point out that the north breaking off into an independent kingdom goes against George's beliefs as far as government goes. Here's what he had to say on his blog about the real-world equivalent of northern independence when Brexit happened. I think Brexit was a mistake. Putting aside the specifics of the situation and taking a long-range look, I think history shows that we do better when we join together into larger political units that embrace diversity rather than building walls and breaking into smaller units. Alexander's empire was better than the squabbling city-states of ancient Greece that preceded it. A pity he did not live long enough to make the union with Persia permanent, and twice a pity that his successors broke it all up into smaller countries to war on each other. The 13 American colonies were wise to join together into one large country, despite their differences, than they would have been as 13 small ones. The nations of Europe have been fighting each other for centuries. Joining together into one multinational nation represents real progress. Eventually, I do hope we will be one peaceful world like the science fiction writers of my youth once predicted. Terra, Old Earth, call it what you will. We're all human. Furthermore, George's views on the benefits of unification are reflected in The World of Ice and Fire, where he makes a similar point in-universe regarding Aegon's unification of most of Westeros. King Aegon, the first of his name, might have conquered the 7 kingdoms by the age of 27, but now he faced the formidable challenge of ruling his newly forged realm. The 7 warring kingdoms had rarely been at peace within their own borders, let alone without them, and uniting them under one rule required a truly remarkable man. So it was fortunate for the realm that Aegon was such a man with vision and determination aplenty, and though his vision of a united Westeros proved harder to realize than Aegon might have believed, not to mention far costlier, it was a vision that shaped the course of history for hundreds of years to come. Just as Alexander the Great's empire and the American colonies were better together than apart, it's clear that George views Westeros as more peaceful united into one realm than it ever was as several ever-changing kingdoms who squabbled with each other. So while I do believe that Bran will be king in the north, I believe it will be a kingship similar to the Principality of Dorne, where they keep their royal titles and maintain their own laws while swearing fealty to the Iron Throne. If the realm is united under Daenerys at the end of the series, I could see her negotiating a similar agreement with the North once they manage to work together in ending the Long Night. So yes, Bran will be king, but no, it will be king in the North, not king of every kingdom except the North. But hey, that's enough from me right now. What do you all think? Let me know down in the comments. And if you're enjoying this content so far,